So what does a backend engineer do? Well, think of it like you're building a city map and you're naming the streets. And you want to name your streets really well because you're designing this map for the front-end engineers who are going to need to use your map. And you're not actually building roads, you're not naming streets, you're naming things called endpoints, API endpoints. And so let's take the very first example. Front-end engineer has built their amazing app and they're about to start integrating your backend. And the very first endpoint they need to call is an endpoint called API/v1/login. Now, what does that street name or endpoint do? Well, you can kind of tell by the name, login, that this endpoint is going to handle login, right? And so all these street names or endpoints, all they are a series of messages that the front end will send the back end, and the back end will send a reply. And it's a conversation between the front end and the back end. So that first conversation, that login conversation, it might go something like, I'm the front end, and I just sent a message to the back end at API endpoint/login with the following information. The email address is johnsmith@gmail.com, and the password is fancyfish17 exclamation point. Okay, so now as the backend engineer, you've now received that message. Okay, and your job is to give a response back to the front end. And in this case, for login, it's kind of a yes or no response. It's like, hey, is that the correct password for johnsmith@gmail.com? Yes or no? So as the backend engineer now, how do you know that information? How do you know what to tell them? Well, you gotta go look that information up somewhere. And the most common thing possible is to look that up in a database called Postgres. That's like 90% of the time. There's other databases, there's other ways to do this, but this is very typical, right? You're gonna contact Postgres, you're gonna say, okay, tell me about John Smith at gmail.com. You know, do you have a record in there for it? So that's the first thing the database might tell you is, never even heard of it. There's no such user as John Smith. Or it might say, yeah, we do have a John Smith, but their password sure isn't fancyfish123 or whatever that was, like, with an exclamation point. That's just the wrong password. Okay, so your first question now might be like, okay, well, wait a minute. What you're doing as your backend engineer is you're talking to this database. Why don't you just have the front end talk directly to the database? You can't because of security. The front end is the general public. The front end are just, anyone out there who's, might be malicious hackers and stuff. And so all they're going to be able to do is hit your back end. Your back end will talk to your database, and that is that security wall right there. Because your database is just going to respond to whatever the back end tells it to do. Your database is like completely open in that sense. Like, for example, there's going to be another API endpoint, another street name called update password. And in that case, and you've probably done this in web apps where you've gone to account settings, change my password, where you've gone ahead and changed your password. And so the backend is going to have a route that contacts the database, and instead of asking, hey, tell me about John Smith, give me that road and tell me if this password is correct, it's going to do something much more concerning in that you're changing information. It's going to do something where it's actually going to say, okay, this time find that row for johnsmith@gmail.com and change the password to I love making videos 874 exclamation point £. Okay, so now you've actually changed the password. So this is a key point of what the backend has to do here, right? The backend is trusted to talk to the database and the front end is not. And so that's just your very first street that we've put in our map that we're building for the front end. We've built the login and we've talked about the update password endpoint, but there's lots of other endpoints. For example, let's say an endpoint's going to be API v1 list purchases. And now this one's going to return a list of every single thing I've bought at this store, maybe. And it's going to have the name of the product, it's going to have the price I paid, it's going to have a link for the image of the product. It's going to have everything the front end might need to be able to display that nicely. And this is what a backend engineer does, right? Is define these endpoints, have this conversation with the front end, give information back and forth. One of the couple other big things a backend engineer has to do is pagination. So in that example I just gave of you're going to list all the products I bought, this is very, very common, which is, well, what if I've bought over the years thousands and thousands of products? That's too big of a message to send back to the front end all in one page. Pagination means break it up into multiple pages. And you've probably seen this throughout the internet where you're on a list of things and at the bottom it says next page, next page, next page. And so the backend engineer has to keep in mind that anytime information is asked for, don't overwhelm the system. Don't give too much. Give it a nice, reasonable chunks, and then have a system where the front end can say, okay, I'd like the list of products, but start on page 2, please. Pagination. And then the last thing I'll leave you with here about what a backend engineer does is scalability. Meaning what happens when it's not just one user hitting your login endpoint or hitting your list products endpoint. What if it's 10 users all at the exact same time? What if it's 1,000 users all at the exact same time? What if it's 100,000 users all at the exact same time? So a backend engineer has to think about that in terms of scalability, meaning, well, what am I going to do when I hit the next level of traffic? And it usually always starts where you build your site where that, there are only 10 users at most at a time, because you're just starting. Very rarely would you build something that can handle 100,000 users concurrently from day one. Unless from day one, you've decided to build a skyscraper and you have the budget for that. Normally, you start off and you build what you need, and then you hit milestones and you decide, okay, at this point, we are going to need to support a lot more users, and that coincides with spending more money. And we'll get into that in another video where we talk about hosting and cloud services.